Locke stipulates there are several conditions under which a people may rightly resist a despotic government, a government that is no longer really a government. How do you know when you're in that kind of situation? How do you know when it's actually all right to oppose the force of a government with force? Locke's argument is pretty straightforward. He thinks that the people are the ultimate judge as to whether or not the government is exercising legitimate power. If the government has been entrusted by the people with political power that the people themselves would have used to govern themselves back in the state of nature, that means the government is, let's call them the agent, and the people is the principal. It's the people's power. The people put it in the government's hands. And the government holds that power on the people's trust. If the government abuses that power, that's up for the people to decide. Who else but the people have the authority to say that the government is illegitimate? The question of judgment is, when it applies to the people, is the question of how can they tell when they have the right to revolution? The question of judgment when it comes to the executive is the question of how to apply the law. You need to use judgment when you're saying, actually, the law should be enforced in this way, or the law shouldn't be enforced in this case. The question of judgment when it comes to the legislative is the question of what the law should be. So the legislative has to use judgment in order to write the laws. So let's be very clear about this. Locke has not got a theory that there's a special branch of government which uses judgment. Okay, judgment stretches throughout the government in the usage of all political power, and judgment also extends into the people themselves, who have the final say, the final judgment over whether that political power is being rightly used. Okay, so sometimes this is called the trustee theory of government. And the idea is the people entrust the government with power. When the government loses the people's trust, they are the ultimate judge as to the legitimacy of that government. This is sometimes called popular sovereignty too. Okay, so let's say that the people judge that the government is illegitimate, that they resist violently. Then what? Well, the idea for Locke is that the civil society will restore a constitutional government. So when we talk about the right of revolution in Locke, what we're really talking about is a restoration of sorts. So when you see Locke talking about the traditional arrangement in England between the king, House of Lords, and the House of Commons, that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of normative relationship he thinks needs to be restored after a kind of despotism or a tyranny. Okay, so revolution doesn't have this kind of 20th century, 21st century meaning of creating something new. It's just the opposite for Locke. Revolution literally means revolving back to a prior satisfactory state after that satisfactory state has become unsatisfactory. So it's literally a kind of circular metaphor. You revolve back. And the underlying idea is that the underlying society is still bound by the social contract. Just because your government broke the terms of the social contract, just because your governors left civil society and started attacking it from the outside, like a thief or a wild beast, those are metaphors that Locke prefers, doesn't mean that all individuals are suddenly no longer bound by the contractual terms. The other way of putting this is the individuals don't return to the state of nature. They don't go all the way back to the state of nature. They are still bound to one another. Okay, so this contract is supposed to be a permanent arrangement. All these individuals need to do is restore a legitimate government. Okay, and this restoration idea is precisely Locke's justification of what was called the Glorious Revolution. So I've got a short video here giving you the basic outlines of the Glorious Revolution. Why don't I go ahead and play this? Let me know in the chat if it's not working. Can you guys hear that? Okay, it's not working.
No, unfortunately.
No.
Yeah. Sorry. I'll just say what the Glorious Revolution was. So the Glorious Revolution was the culmination of a set of conflicts between king and parliament over who would ultimately be sovereign, who would be the supreme power in the Commonwealth. And there were people on the king's side who basically said that the king's power is absolute. They went by a variety of names. Sometimes they were called royalists, sometimes they were called Tories. And there were people who were on the side of parliament. And they also went by a variety of names. Sometimes they were called parliamentarians and sometimes they were called royalists. And they supported what was called parliamentary supremacy. Locke was definitely on that latter side, parliamentary supremacy. So the idea was, or actually what happened was, King James II decided that he didn't need Parliament to help rule England. He decided he was really going to just be the sole authority and the sole power. And there was an additional complication, which is that England at the time was an Anglican country, It had a church. The Church of England was the established church. James II was a Catholic. And there were fears that there was a kind of popish plot to have England being ruled by a foreign power, the Pope. Okay, so a group of parliamentarians and anti-Catholic Protestants got together and they said, we have decided that this monarchy is absolute and despotic and tyrannical. We are going to invite William and Mary, who are in the Netherlands and who are distant relatives of James, actually. So it's part of the same house with the same family. William and Mary will become our new king and queen, and they'll come with an army. They didn't have to use the army, but there was also a threat of force here. So according to Locke, those armies could have used force to resist the tyranny of King James, but they didn't have to. It was a bloodless revolution. William and Mary ascend to the throne, but they also accept certain limitations on their power. They accept the idea that both Parliament and the king will wield political power. They accept the idea that Parliament is ultimately sovereign, and as a sign of their acceptance, they accepted something now known to history as the English Bill of Rights. And these are explicit limitations on what the government cannot do, for example, to the subjects or the people of England. So no arbitrary searches and seizures, for example. You can't just bust into somebody's house and rummage through their papers arbitrarily if you're a government agent. And a lot of that language actually made it into the United States Bill of Rights about 100 years later. Okay, so restoration is the idea behind Locke's justification of the Glorious Revolution, we can take a look at the preface to the Second Treatise of Government, where Locke says, okay, you've got some discourses here. He says, these discourses, I hope, are sufficient to establish the throne of our great restorer, our present King William. So talking about William and Mary. Here, interestingly, he leaves out Mary. To make good his title in the consent of the people, which being the only one of all lawful governments, he has more fully and clearly than any prince in Christendom. So according to Locke, King William has the consent of the people basically more than any other government in the world. And these discourses are also meant to justify to the world, the people of England, whose love of their just and natural rights, with the resolution to preserve them, saved the nation when it was on the very brink of slavery and ruin. And that's the situation with James II. Okay, so that's the restoration language. This restoration idea has some resonances with the American Revolution about a century later, but there's a crucial difference. The difference is Jefferson could not make an argument for the restoration of a normative relationship between Britain and the British colonies. Because, first of all, the British colonies, for example, never had representation in Parliament. And the British colonists were very upset about that, especially when it came to taxation. But there was no normative relationship to restore in the way that Locke thought there was a normative relationship between king and parliament that needed to be restored. Okay, so that's one problem. And another problem with the Lockean restoration argument is even if there were a normative relationship to restore, that would have meant the British Americas remained a part of the British Empire, which is precisely the opposite of what Jefferson and the other founders of the United States wanted. They actually wanted to found a whole new civil society. So on the Jeffersonian idea, it's not that the British colonists fell all the way back into the state of nature. It was more like the idea that they would separate and have their own social contract. So here's the Jeffersonian argument. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. Okay, so what they're basically announcing in this declaration from the get-go is the intention to dissolve political bands and to separate and become a separate civil society. What's the justification for this? Well, Jefferson says there are some self-evident truths. These are all very familiar, and we'll talk about them again when we come to Hannah Arendt's On Revolution at the end of this course. But then listen to what Locke says in this Jefferson says in the second sentence of this second paragraph. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Sounds very Lockean. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of the ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such a form as to them shall most likely to seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So according to Jefferson, if the government becomes tyrannical or despotic, the people can abolish it and institute a new government. And that is quite different than what Locke was talking about. So instead of revolution being a kind of restoration, revolution now becomes a creation of a whole new civil society with a whole new government.